Brooklyn, January 1979. Thomas DeSimone entered a quiet storefront, expecting to be formally inducted into the Lucchese family. Instead, he vanished. Nearly 9 years earlier, in June 1970, William Billy Batts Bentvena, a made member of the Gambino family, had been beaten and killed, with later federal accounts placing DeSimone at the scene. Under the rigid code governing New York's 5 families, killing a made man without authorization carried a mandatory response. By 1979, that debt remained unpaid. His disappearance was not sudden violence. It was enforcement, a cross-family judgment carried out without announcement or appeal. If you're here for the documented reality, not the Hollywood version, stay with this story. The real Tommy, a soldier inside a corporate crime system. In the 1970s, New York's underworld did not run on impulse. It ran on structure. The Lucchese crime family, one of the 5 families of New York, operated like a layered corporation with a boss, underboss, consigliere, caporegimes, soldiers, and associates. Each role carried financial expectations and defined authority. Thomas DeSimone was not a boss. He was not even a made member. He was an associate, useful, ambitious, and violent. His value came from enforcement and hijacking operations, particularly those orbiting John F. Kennedy International Airport in Queens. Cargo theft was not random theft. It was calculated extraction. Inside contacts tipped off crews about high-value shipments, electronics, liquor, designer goods, often before they cleared customs. Trucks were intercepted. Warehouses quietly redirected inventory. Profits were divided upward through the chain of command. Revenue flowed predictably. A percentage to the crew, a larger portion to the supervising caporegime. Tribute to the family leadership. Stability depended on predictability. Above the 5 families sat the Commission, the coordinating body that prevented open warfare between New York's crime syndicates. Disputes were mediated, territories respected, violence regulated. DeSimone operated inside this framework. His aggression made money, but aggression also carried risk. In a system designed to protect revenue and political insulation, a man's usefulness lasted only as long as he understood the limits of the structure that empowered him. He earned well. He moved quickly, but he was never above the hierarchy. The rule Hollywood skipped. Killing a made man without authorization. Within American Cosa Nostra, initiation changed everything. A made man was formally inducted through ritual, sponsored by his family and bound by oath. He was not simply an earner. He was protected property of his organization. To harm him without authorization was not a personal offense. It was an institutional breach. The rule was clear. No associate, and not even another made member, could kill a made man without approval from family leadership. In certain situations, particularly when the target belonged to another family, authorization required consultation beyond a single boss. The Commission existed precisely to prevent impulsive violence from destabilizing business alliances. This was not sentiment. It was governance. The 5 families of New York shared rackets that stretched across unions, construction sites, waterfront docks, and airport terminals. Kill the wrong man without clearance, and you risked retaliation. Retaliation threatened profits. Profits sustained political relationships. Politicians, union officials, and corrupt intermediaries depended on quiet stability. When a made man was murdered without sanction, the offense could not be ignored. Ignoring it signaled weakness. Failing to respond invited further disorder. In June 1970, in Manhattan, William Billy Batts Bentvena of the Gambino crime family was beaten and killed. The man widely believed to be responsible was Thomas DeSimone, an associate with no formal standing, acting without permission. In that moment, he did more than commit murder. He broke a rule designed to protect the entire system. The Gambino breach, William Bentvena, and the cost of impulsiveness. June 1970, Manhattan, New York. William Billy Batts Bentvena had recently returned from federal prison. As a made member of the Gambino crime family, his release carried significance. In the internal culture of Cosa Nostra, prison time enhanced reputation. It signaled loyalty, silence, endurance. A man who had stood up earned recognition when he came home. Bentvena walked into a nightclub expecting that recognition. He was not a low-level enforcer. He was formally inducted, sworn in through ritual, and sponsored within a family that held deep influence over New York's construction unions, waterfront labor, and freight corridors. His status was institutional. Harm against him was not merely personal, it implicated hierarchy. Inside the club, tensions surfaced. Accounts vary in detail, but consistent testimony from later federal proceedings describes an argument escalating into a sustained assault. Thomas DeSimone, then an associate aligned with Lucchese-linked crews, was widely identified as a central participant. Bentvena was beaten severely and ultimately killed. His remains were reportedly transported and buried outside the city, though the exact location was never definitively confirmed. The murder did more than eliminate one man. It ruptured an understanding between families. A Lucchese associate had taken part in killing a Gambino-made member without authorization from leadership. That act bypassed negotiated protocol, undermined diplomatic channels, and threatened reciprocal retaliation. Organized crime endured not because it tolerated impulsiveness, but because it contained it. In one night, DeSimone crossed a boundary designed to prevent inter-family war. From that point forward, he carried more than ambition. He carried debt. Subscribe for documented examinations of organized power and the systems behind it. Why the system couldn't ignore it. Risk, optics, and inter-family diplomacy. New York's organized crime families were rivals, but they were also business partners. They shared rackets across the city. Construction bid rigging in Manhattan, concrete contracts in Brooklyn, freight and cargo theft near John F. Kennedy International Airport in Queens, waterfront labor influence along the Hudson. Stability preserved profits. The killing of Billy Batts threatened that balance. If the Gambino leadership appeared weak for failing to respond, their authority eroded. If the Lucchese family shielded DeSimone without consequence, it signaled indifference to shared governance. Either outcome risked retaliation. Retaliation meant surveillance, indictments, disrupted cash flow, and unwanted public attention. By the early 1970s, federal law enforcement pressure on the five families was already intensifying. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, passed in 1970, gave prosecutors new tools to pursue organized crime leadership. Internal disputes that escalated publicly increased exposure. This was no longer about personal revenge. It was optics. It was risk management. A murder left unresolved between families could fracture diplomatic agreements negotiated quietly through bosses and intermediaries. Shared unions could splinter. Cooperative ventures could stall. Political allies could distance themselves. For leadership, the question was simple. How do you enforce discipline without destabilizing revenue? In a system built on controlled violence and negotiated order, failure to act was not mercy. It was mismanagement. The Lufthansa context, cash, exposure, and internal liability. December 11, 1978. Just after 3 a.m., armed men entered the Lufthansa cargo terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport in Queens, New York. They left with approximately $6 million in cash and valuables, at the time, the largest cash robbery in American history. The scale of the theft altered the landscape overnight. The robbery, widely attributed to associates connected to the Lucchese family, triggered intense federal scrutiny. Investigators focused on airport operations. Informants were pressured, and surveillance widened. What had once been a quiet revenue engine became a national headline. For Thomas DeSimone, the heist amplified risk. He was tied to a crew, suddenly swimming in cash, and therefore subject to suspicion, jealousy, and fear. In organizations dependent on silence, visibility is dangerous. His prior role in the killing of Gambino Captain William Bentvena had never been formally erased. It remained a diplomatic debt between families. While earnings flowed, leadership could justify delay. But the Lufthansa robbery changed the calculus. Under rising law enforcement pressure and media attention, any unresolved violation became a liability. A volatile associate with a history of crossing interfamily lines represented compounded exposure. If arrests followed, internal fractures might surface. Old grievances could become bargaining chips. The heist did not create the problem. It stripped away the protection that had once shielded him. Decision at the top, hierarchy, approval, and the mechanics of execution. Within American Cosa Nostra, enforcement traveled upward before it moved outward. A cop regime could recommend action. A boss could weigh risk. But when interfamily violations were involved, particularly the killing of a made man, broader consultation often followed. The commission functioned as the governing body overseeing disputes among the five families. Its existence and role have been referenced in federal prosecutions, including U.S. v. by Anthony and Delicato, which described the Commission as a coordinating authority designed to regulate conflict and preserve stability. The rule was clear. Killing a made member without authorization disrupted negotiated order. Enforcement restored equilibrium. By early 1979, accounts from later cooperating witnesses suggest Thomas DeSimone believed he was being called to Brooklyn for a ceremony, possibly formal induction into the Lucchese family. Instead, he disappeared. No official confirmation followed. No public display was made. Executions within this system were rarely theatrical. They were administrative corrections designed to satisfy diplomatic debt, remove risk, and signal that hierarchy remained intact. Profit did not override protocol. Earnings did not purchase exemption. The decision was not chaotic. It was organizational. And once made, it required no announcement. Disappearance as message. Enforcement without spectacle. By early 1979, Thomas DeSimone had vanished from Brooklyn. There was no police tape, no public retaliation, no dramatic gunfire spilling into the streets. The city moved forward without interruption. Yet within the underworld, the silence was unmistakable. Reputation in organized crime is rarely shaped by press conferences. It is shaped by absence. By who is no longer seen at social clubs, who stops attending meetings, who simply dissolves from routine. DeSimone's disappearance was not chaotic. It was controlled. Among New York's 5 families, Gambino, Lucchese, Genovese, Bonanno, and Colombo, stability depended on restraint. Open warfare risked surveillance, indictments, and collapsed rackets. Their strength rested on negotiated territories, shared unions, waterfront operations, construction contracts, and freight routes moving quietly through ports and airports. Violence was permitted, but only when it reinforced order. DeSimone's removal resolved several tensions simultaneously. It answered the unresolved breach involving William Bentvena. It reassured Gambino leadership that hierarchy remained intact. It relieved Lucchese leadership of the burden of defending an unpredictable associate during a period of heightened federal scrutiny following the Lufthansa robbery. Most importantly, it reaffirmed that structure outweighed personality. The message did not need headlines. It traveled through conversations between capos, through tightened expressions in back rooms, through the understanding that even the most profitable earner could be removed if he endangered institutional balance. The docks kept operating. Concrete contracts continued. Union negotiations remained steady. Political intermediaries faced no disruption. In this system, disappearance was not mystery. It was maintenance, and maintenance required no spectacle. Hollywood versus structure. What Goodfellas Simplified. When Goodfellas premiered in 1990, audiences met Tommy DeVito, volatile, magnetic, and explosively dangerous. Modeled on Thomas DeSimone, the character's death arrives in one of the film's most memorable scenes, a sudden execution staged as punishment for killing Billy Batts. The moment is swift and humiliating. It feels like revenge delayed, pride finally avenged. As cinema, it works flawlessly. But what the film compresses into a single emotional beat was, in reality, rooted in something slower and more structural. Organized crime in 1970s New York was not sustained by temperament alone. It was governed by rank, tribute systems, territorial agreements, and negotiated understandings between families. The killing of a Gambino made member without authorization was not merely a personal insult. It was a violation of interfamily protocol, a breach that touched revenue streams, alliances, and the credibility of leadership itself. That issue did not erupt overnight. It lingered. It was contained. It existed in the background as business continued. By the late 1970s, the stakes had shifted. The Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act had strengthened federal prosecutors. Informants were emerging. The Lufthansa heist intensified scrutiny around airport rackets tied to multiple crews. Under heightened pressure, unresolved liabilities became more dangerous. In that climate, a volatile associate with a history of crossing structural boundaries represented compounded risk. Enforcement, when it came, reflected calculation as much as retaliation. The film tells a story centered on personality, on ego, humiliation, and violent pride. The historical record points toward preservation of order. Behind the myth of sudden vengeance lay a system that survived through memory, discipline, and control. The rule beneath the myth: stability through controlled violence. Thomas DeSimone's disappearance was not simply the end of a violent man. It was a demonstration of how American Cosa Nostra preserved itself. Beneath the mythology of impulsive gangsters and cinematic chaos lay a structure built on restraint. Rules were not moral guidelines, they were safeguards. They prevented reckless bloodshed from destabilizing revenue streams, political relationships, and negotiated territories. Killing a made man without authorization was not forbidden because it was cruel. It was forbidden because it threatened order. Order protected profit. Profit sustained influence. Influence required insulation from rivals, from federal prosecutors, from public scrutiny. In that sense, the organization functioned less like a street gang and more like a corporation enforcing internal compliance. Violations were addressed not with speeches, but with removal, quietly, efficiently, permanently. The myth suggests crime survives through fear alone. The record suggests it survives through structure. And that raises an uncomfortable question. When power operates through unwritten rules, negotiated authority, and controlled discipline, how different is organized crime from other institutions that claim legitimacy? Subscribe for documented underworld history beyond the Hollywood version.